Hi, George. How are you doing?
Oops, I was on mute. I'm doing good, Rory. How are you?
Good. Yes, I'm so glad that you're hosting this interesting space.
Yes, it is an experiment just to see, how it will take. But the good thing is that because it's recorded, we can also repurpose it after. And we've also got another person with us, Iosua. If I've actually sent you a notification or an invite to come speak on stage, so just check your notifications to see it so I can bring you up. So Rory, Iosua is like he's really deep into the ancient wisdom stuff, and especially from around the Pacific. And I invited him today so he can share some of his wisdom too, because to me it's just yeah, mind blowing. Some of the stuff that he shares.
Wonderful.
Yes,
Oh, yes. Well, I'm eager to listen to it all. So
perfect.
thank you for bringing us together. And is it Iosha?
Yosua. Well, he can.
Yosua.
Yes, but I think he can also, when he comes on, he can share how to pronounce it properly, in case that is not the case. So I'm just going to try inviting him again.
Great.
I'm speaking to him on Facebook at the same time.
Okay, super cool. And then I'd love to hear more about which region of the world you focused on in your research so
Ah,
far.
for sure. Well, I guess, yeah, while you're on and while I'm trying to get Yosua on, I can talk a bit about that. So for me, it definitely started with the South Pacific, right? Because my heritage is Polynesian. So my mother, Tuvaluan Samoan, dad, Fijian Indian, born in Fiji, moved to Australia. And because of just, I guess, my upbringing, moved around a lot around Asia Pacific. And I noticed that I'd always find these similarities between, things from my own culture and things that I'd see with indigenous cultures specifically in different parts of Asia. And then as I started traveling the world more, I noticed that actually the indigenous groups around the Ring of Fire, so around the Pacific Ocean, there are also just a lot more commonalities, both physically, culturally, the love for food, song, and dance. And I just started digging deeper from there. And that's where it started pulling me back into ancient civilizations, and where I realized that a lot of the stories that even, say, for example, like my ancestors had, a lot of that disappeared after Christianity entered, our histories. And Yosua, who I'm going to still try to get him. Are you on? Are you on? Hey, you made it.
Had to install the mic. Sorry.
Ah, excellent. Well, brother, thank you so much for making it. And for Rory, could you please, just introduce yourself and let her know how to say your name properly?
Yeah, sure. Hi, Rory. I'm Iosua, but you can just call me Josh.
Does that
Yeah,
work, Rory?
that's more comfortable.
Radio, nice to meet you. Yosua?
Hi, how are
Yosua Josh. May I say both?
you? I grew up with both.
Yeah, fabulous.
Nice.
Perfect.
Yes, well, I'm excited. I know, George, based on what you were saying, it did make me think of research I had done years
Mm,
ago into common symbols
yep.
worldwide. So, like the Ouroboros, I had noticed I was making a PowerPoint
Yep.
presentation and I had seen it in Ireland, I had seen it in China, as well as many dolmen kind of tombs or structures and pyramids all around the world.
Yes.
So I think this is so fascinating, the ancient history. And then I just love to hear, more from you and Josh here.
Yes.
You saw it, Josh.
Perfect. Actually, this is great because I've been meaning to catch up with Yosua anyways. So, Yosua, this is kind of this is like going to be a catch up between you and I that is just being recorded on X, and we'll just go from there. How does that sound?
Sounds fun.
All right, brother. Okay, so maybe for those who may be tuning in later, do you want to just give a little intro about yourself, and I'll do an intro about mine, and then yeah,
Yeah, sure.
we'll dive into topics.
Yeah. So first of all, I'm a teacher. The stuff that I'm into these days is not necessarily a reflection of my formal academic preparation. It's largely been kind of a obsession slash hobby slash promise that I made to family members who passed that were into the genealogy part of it some years ago, about 2000, really. The year 2000, not 2000 years ago. But so my journey basically has started with a complete lack of interest in my own ancestry and my heritage, up to a certain point in my life where suddenly an aunt of mine who was a genealogist and also a history teacher passed, and she had done all this amazing research on all sides of our family, including the European part of our family, but the Hawaiian side was really weak because there's a kind of a brick wall you hit when you start dealing in Pacific geology, sorry, not geology, but genealogies, that kind of ties in with the colonialism aspect of the state of Hawaii. Well, what is now the state of Hawaii.
Yeah. And also, Iosua, sorry,
Yep.
yes, just for context for people as well. Yeah, what is your ancestral background?
Oh, yes, sure. My ancestral background primarily is Samoan. After doing the DNA testing, we found out that there's lots of Tongan in there as well, which makes a lot of sense when you start digging into the genealogies. And then on my mother's side is the Hawaiian side and European. So I would say about 1/4 European of extraction, and then the rest is all Pacific Islander and Native American.
Oh man, fascinating. Yeah, a lot of similarities there too. So just wanted to give a quick shout out to Youngsu. Hey brother, thanks for making it. Good to see you here. And Tirsa, I noticed that you just hopped on as well. So just to add on to for the others, Iosua, my mother is Tuvaluan Samoan, my father Fijian Indian, and that is also how I came across Iosua through the Facebook network, because most of the Polynesians are mostly on Facebook, especially all the aunties and uncles. And yeah, I'll give it back to you, Iosua, to continue.
Oh yeah, no problem. So my research kind of really started to pick up where my aunt had left off, and as of that point, I had not yet known terribly much about my Samoan ancestry because my father didn't really know a whole lot until he went back. We started learning things about our particular family, our ancestry in Tutuila, and our connection to also Ofu in the Manua group, and also to the Western Samoan group. And I started digging into the genealogy on the far, which is actually very well connected because our surname Fa'ang'e it's tied in with a bunch of Samoan history, which I never knew growing up, and so my interest really started to blossom from this point on in just strictly Polynesian culture. Along the way, while I was researching the Hawaiian side, I started coming across these really strange. Well, I thought they were strange. These peculiar, references in, I guess I don't want to say missionary work necessarily, in correspondences from the 1800s between scholars who were from Europe, looking at the Pacific Islander cultures, and they kept, throwing out these really interesting theories about the origins of Polynesians, and some of them were that Maori, for example, in Aotearoa, they were from, probably India, or the other one, the claim there is that they're of Aryan extraction, which was very, very intriguing, but didn't seem to really resonate well for some reason. I couldn't figure out why. And then the other claim was that, and this probably circles around back to the Mormon Church and their presence in the Pacific, to the belief that a lot of Native Americans and Polynesians were the remnants of the lost tribes of Israel. And so there's like a Semitic side to the research inquiry that I had, and that kind of shocked me. And I grew up with mythology, a lot of church, a lot of reading, and it was just a sort of weird fascination for me, as well as languages. And those claims, I kind of wanted to disprove them because I didn't feel like, hey, I'm not an Israelite. I don't feel like I'm from the Middle East. I've been to the Middle East. I know what it looks like, and I know what people from there look like. And I thought I knew, sort of. I had this opinion about our place as people in the diaspora, the Polynesian diaspora, and then how we, related to the rest of the people in the rest of the world. And I didn't see that kind of a connection. But over time, I started digging into linguistics. I realized, I can't really prove or disprove anything until I start learning the languages a little bit, studying where the evolution of a particular language family came from. And so I started digging into Hebrew, and then from there you start tracing backwards further to Akkadian. And on the Aryan side, I started trying to learn Sanskrit, and everything starts to converge in Asian languages for me in that sort of realm where you're now looking at not just Polynesian, you're looking at Southeast Asia, island Southeast Asia, which includes like Malaysia, Indonesia, Java, Bali. And then on the Indian side, because it is continental, I started entertaining the theory that, hey, what if there's a deeper connection between Polynesians and Asia? And that's another thing, too, that you come across when you start looking at, for example, Edward Traeger's comparative Maori and Polynesian dictionary from the late 1800s, which is really exhaustive. And I don't think I've seen another work of that scale or magnitude since then, which is unfortunate, because I think that with all the tools that are now available to us with supercomputing and databases and telecommunications, all that kind of a project would have a much more, I don't know, just more depth to it than he was able to achieve. And it's a pretty astonishingly, in my opinion, complete work that kind of leaves a lot of breadcrumbs and trails for us and now in the current generations to be able to follow and sort of ask the questions like, okay, well, is there really a connection between the Hawaiian word inu and a Malaysian minum, spelled minum, in their in the current orthography for Malaysian? And there is, it's like you trace it, you follow the linguistic drift. There's this theory that was really expounded on by the father of linguistics, Edward Sapir, in the 1900s. And he coined this, I believe it was him who coined the notion of this idea that language evolves over time and distance. And it adheres to certain rules. And these rules are almost predictable, to where if you have a codex of the sorts where it's based on what's called regularity of shift. For example, the regularity of shift between Samoan and Hawaiian is that the k sound, the hard K, the glottal stop sound, sorry, not the glottal stop, but the fricative stop sound becomes a glottal stop in some languages. So instead of saying talofa, you might say aloha. The first consonant,
Yeah.
it is absorbed. It transforms from a T sound to a K sound, and from the K sound to what's the glottal stop, the okina, the sound between o and So anyway, so that kind of blossomed into a whole bunch of other things. I started delving into comparative mythology because I saw, once you start getting into this vast, breadth of cultures, histories, and languages, which is really way more than any one person can really hope to master at any point in any lifetime. You start to see these interesting recurring themes and patterns, especially when you're looking at material culture, things like technologies that could have been transmitted from one people to another. And for me, the key thing is that we're talking about people and technologies that are transferred by ocean. The most powerful, I think, means of communication throughout all history has always been boats.
Yeah. No, man. Yeah,
Right?
that's a very good point. Um, oh, man, bro. I think in the future we're gonna have to do like a video recorded session, because I know there's actually a lot of stuff that you've shared that we could screen share while we're talking. Because there was one post that you just put up about like 17 hours ago. I don't know if it was on your page or in the group, but you had put some stuff up about the Moai on Easter Island, right? And like the theories around how the hell they moved those giant heads, right? The
Oh,
Moai.
yeah.
Yeah, what did you learn
Yeah,
there?
that's well, okay. So here's an interesting thing. I was actually listening to one of my favorite scholars. His name is Robert Schock.
Mm,
He's a geologist who was trained at Yale, and is I guess he's teaching now out of Boston University.
mm,
So really interesting book that he published, and he's considered fringe geology right now because of some of the theories that he's entertaining and the areas of the field that he's looking at. Namely, I think the biggest part of the critique against him is that he's bothering to look at the whole Atlantis uh, thing,
mm,
the whole realm of Atlantis stories,
mm,
which I think that's unfortunate because we have a whole planet full of people
Mm,
who are regarding Old Testament as literal truth, and yet you're ruling out something that Plato, who is much more recent,
mm,
writing about this story
yeah.
in circa 300 something
Mm,
BC. We rule all that out, even though we're buying, carte blanche, this story that's emerged from, 1200 BC,
mm,
which is 600 years older.
mm,
Questionably, arguably it could be thought of as less reliable than a document that was produced more recently by a scholar who's the foundation of a lot of modern philosophy, right?
mm.
So seems strange.
Yeah, no,
So,
100%. Yeah.
but yeah, Robert Schock. I was reading this book he's written,
Mm,
and there's this trip that he made to Rapanui where he started making these observations as a geologist,
mm,
and this ties into his theory about the age of the Sphinx, and he thinks that the Sphinx goes back to probably at least the end of the last ice age, which is the Holocene, the onset of the Holocene epoch,
mm,
and that's about 10,000 BC, right? He bases this theory on the alignment of the head of the Sphinx with the vernal equinox and the constellation Leo in its placement at that time.
mm,
I guess the theory is roughly that the sun is directly in perfect alignment with the middle of the Sphinx's head at the rise of the sun on that particular moment in history. And then he links it to the age of Rapa Nui based on his observations that he saw with the Sphinx in Egypt, is that there's weathering patterns that are unmistakable to him as a geologist who's very highly trained at a reputable university, with the kinds of striation patterns, or I mean weathering patterns and sedimentary layers and stuff around the bases and the surfaces of the moai in Rapa Nui. And that got me thinking, because he's talking about, the stories that crop up about how the moai were placed all over the island in the positions that they are, because they're huge. They're multi-ton. They're tens of tons heavy. A small crew of simple people who were Paleolithic, or sorry, Neolithic, technology users, at least in the minds of academia at the present, are not up to the task of moving such a large thing without going into these really elaborate theories about how they were moved and how they destroyed the island. There's a figure by the name of Jared Diamond who wrote a book claiming that the Rapa Nui people who live there destroyed the island through all kinds of using trees, deforestation of the island, in order to satisfy this obsession that they had with something to do with the moai, the erecting of the moai all around the island, their quarrying, and then their transportation all around the island. But the thing that keeps popping up in the narrative, according to Schock, that he's drawing on from his visits with some very high level people in Easter Island who are native, is this notion that they were walking, that the Moai walked from the places that they were quarried. And, some of the places he thinks aren't necessarily even above water at this time. As he's going back to this idea that it's possible, based on the weathering he's seen and the kind of sedimentary debris and distressing on the surfaces of the statues, that they could be possibly just as old, going back to the ice age, if not before. And if they were from before the ice age, he's saying that when the sea levels were lower, the kind of stone that a lot of the Moai were built from are characteristic of the kind of stone that you would find at lower levels of a continent or an island, right?
yeah.
And at that time, 300 feet shallower of the water, I should say, when the sea levels were much lower, whatever those quarries were that were under the water, they're now currently buried. And so there's a chance, he thinks, that some of the stone might have actually come from a time before the island's coastlines were swallowed up by the rapid sea level change that occurred in what's called the meltwater pulses, which occurred starting 12,000 years ago through up to possibly as recently as 8 to 10,000 years ago, which ties into the time frames given by Plato for the destruction of Atlantis by a flood. And that flood stuff is really interesting because there's probably no other story around the world from the ancient times that is so distributed around the planet with consistent details. We're talking about the gods decide the fate of man. Men don't deserve to continue Many of them, except for one, decide that all humans have to be wiped off the face of the planet. They choose the means to be in the form of a flood. One of the gods dissents from the rest and happens to whisper secrets to one of his followers. That follower is told, build a boat, tear down your house, and save all life.
Yeah.
And that pops up in Polynesian mythology. In fact, it even pops up in the language of our own traditional oral traditions,
Interesting.
right?
In your
The word
research,
mother.
Yosua, in your research though, have you found like enough, I guess, records about our historical accounts of that story, or compared to obviously records that have been made in other cultures, regions, right? Have you found enough from, I guess the Pacific region?
So I focus on the
Mm,
languages and the oral traditions that have been preserved as much as possible
mm,
in writing first contact. The reason why I look mostly to dictionaries, for example, from the early 1800s, George Pratt, for example, Reverend George Pratt published a Samoan dictionary. He started his work in 1860
mm,
something, and he'd already been in Samoa for about 30 years. So he's looking at, what he's writing in the book is what Samoan sounded like not very long after first contact,
mm.
right? So the vocabulary there, ideally, is as close to pristine as possible, I think.
Wow.
You compare it to other, island groups that were, were missionaries and colonies were established much later,
Mm,
and you have sort of a more of a loss of the native language. And Hawaiian, for example, is a really great example. And I think there's a lot of the language still preserved it, but there was a period where Hawaiians were, basically forbidden from speaking the native language, and a lot of it's been recovered through, a lot of research, a lot of effort on the part of Native people
mm,
and scholars that are allies to the Native people, and they've been able to do that. And I think some of that too comes from a lot of comparative linguistics work
mm,
where they're looking at words like, for example, the word for fishhook,
mm,
makau, Hawaiian.
mm,
Well, you look to Samoan as a great example. It's almost the same thing. It means anchor,
mm,
right? Makau. But then you also compare that to all the other dialects. I call them dialects because we're all part of the Moana,
mm.
the blue continent, if you want to use that terminology. I've heard that thrown around by some scholars who are in the field of Indigenous American
Yeah.
research, and I think it's really apropos, actually.
Mm,
But yeah, so comparing certain words, and you follow it back, trace it back, and so they've been able to reestablish the language in really a lot of depth too. I think I often refer to Hawaiian dictionaries from the 1800s, or at least those that have derived much from that period, because that's as close as you can get to first contact versions of the language.
wow. Okay, there are two things from everything that you shared that I want to maybe dive into a bit more. One is the links with the Israelites, and the second is technology and the ocean. So maybe we'll start with the. Oh, Rory, did you want to say something? I just saw you on mute there.
Yes, thank
Yeah.
you. I wanted to ask Yosua, what is the word that you were mentioning related to the flood story?
Which word? Let's see here. The
It
flood
was a
story.
word related to
Was it the hook?
the origin of
Oh,
the flood. Was it the hook word, or you were going to mention a word earlier that was an example of how the origin of humanity by the flood story
Oh, sure.
that
Yes.
was evidence in the language?
Yeah. Is that Manu? So in most of the Polynesian dialects, Manu means bird or beast,
hmm.
right? But if you adhere to the theory that there is a lineage of language that followed us out into the Pacific from island Southeast Asia, which is most likely the case, because you follow the breadcrumbs, the linguistic breadcrumbs lead you right back to Indonesia, Bali, Java, Malaysia.
Mm,
A lot of similarities there. Well, here's the thing: Malaysia and Indonesia both have a lot of Hindu and a lot of contact with Islam. In fact, the largest
mm,
Muslim population is Indonesia. More than any other country that is, where the state religion is Islam, Indonesians have more of that. more people who follow that religion, which is really fascinating. And I didn't know that until I started digging into the linguistics. I kept seeing words in Samoan which were conspicuously Semitic in nature. For example, what's the color for yellow in Samoan?
The color for yellow? Wait, what did you say?
What's the word for the color yellow in Samoan?
Oh man, that's a good question. What is the
Sama.
word?
The word is sama.
Sama.
One word is sama. It's reference to the use of, or it used to be, I don't know about nowadays, in reference to the use of turmeric in powdered form, which is colored yellow, to as a like a cosmetic application to brighten the skin. That's clearly that is a lineage that goes all the way back to India, because that is a practice used in India. But that I don't think it stops there, because the word itself, though, sama, while it means yellow, it sounds very, very similar to the Semitic word for sun and day, which is shamash. What color is the sun? Sun's yellow, right? That's one example, one word. There's a lot of that happening, though, in the Polynesian language. And it's not just Semitic languages that I'm detecting. I don't know why, but it's also a lot of Sanskrit. So back to the word manu, for example. Manu, while it means bird and beast, if we assume that it is definitely related to Sanskrit or some Indian language in some manner, well, hey, there is a long tradition of figures by the name of Manu in Hinduism, and it relates to the flood story. So one of the flood heroes was a king by the name of Manu, and it ties in with the story of Vishnu, the god, who's part of the triarchy of deities: Vishnu, Shiva, and Brahma, the supreme. Vishnu is typically portrayed as associated with water. He's a very interesting deity, and he's the creator deity, while his brother or co-equal is Shiva, who's considered like the destroyer deity in certain respects. And they have like a positive negative balance in the religion. And that's just one version of the religion. There's a lot of different varieties of Hinduism, just like there's a lot of varieties of Buddhism and Christianity and all the other the different sects of Islam. But with respect to Manu, he is definitely, that name at least, is definitely tied to the flood story. And in the story, all humanity is destroyed. There's a few survivors. The main survivor, who becomes the ruler of humanity after the flood, is Manu. His name ends up evolving into a variety of different words, including Manava. The word in Sanskrit for human or child is Manava. In most Polynesian dialects, Manava is like the feeling in your belly when there's a child in it. So the protuberance of the belly, the underside of the belly where the baby sits, rides, that's Manava. But Manava is also the little spot on the top of the baby's head, which is what's called the anterior fontanelle, the soft spot in the top of the head. That too is also Manava. So, but the thing is that it relates to new birth. It relates to a child.
Fascinating.
And so, tracing back, the word mana also for spiritual power that is often getted, and I think it's mistranslated, or rather it's oversimplified and combined too many concepts into one and summed up as a supernatural word that has to deal with like spiritual power and magic. I think that's an oversimplification. I think that if you follow that word back, mana is simply the ability to think, to reason, which is mankind's greatest power, the ability to think and reason and organize, and that is more powerful, I think, than any kind of magic. And that might have been involved in the moving of the Moai, for example. And that's where it comes back to where, the other thing you're talking about with the Moai story is that the word for walk, I wasn't sure which word they used because it's hard to find any native account in the original language about, in what way they walked, which word for walk was used when they talk about the Moai walking from their quarries, right? So I looked at all of the words for walk. And what's really interesting is that if you look at all the words for walk, you find all these clues about different modalities that could have been used to transport the moai from point A to point B, even on water, which I thought was really fascinating. Because one word for walk is au in Hawaiian and Samoan, or kau, which is one in some of the other Eastern Polynesian dialects, including Maori. And it's also the word for ship's crew, which is interesting. And it's also related to